As you all head in the direction that the Treants told you about, you eventually come to a small clearing. You can feel the magic of the forest in the air, but something's off about it. Several of the trees in the clearing seem to be either dead or dying from some sort of disease. Off to one side, you can see what looks like an old makeshift hut covered in moss and elvish runes, made out of an old stump that was once a giant tree. As you poke your head inside, you see a person laying on a bed in the middle of the room. Plants and flowers seem to be growing rapidly around them, and almost immediately you can tell they're no longer alive. Hello, and welcome to Tuna's Tales. This time on Pondering Monsters, we'll be covering part 2 to the last video. In case you haven't seen it, I've included a link down in the description so that you can check it out and get all the details. Before continuing with the video though, I want to talk briefly about my plans around encounters moving forward. I wrote and recorded this in the middle of the whole OGL situation back in late January. Luckily, things seem to have worked out alright with that for now, but I don't really feel up to covering things published by Wizards of the Coast directly. I still enjoy making monster encounters and plan to do so, but moving forward, I'm going to switch to focusing on content put out by other 5e publishers over things put out by Wizards. That brings me to the topic of this week's Pondering Monsters. I originally planned to use 3 dryads for this, but have since rewritten it to use the Splinter Matron from Kobold Press's Tome of Beasts 3. According to the lore around this creature, it's actually a former dryad whose tree got sick and, in trying to cling to life, has become warped and twisted herself. So if you're curious what your party can do about all this, then come along as we look at just what this hike in the woods is all about. After meeting with the Treants in the forest from the last video, the party was instructed to seek the old druid that lives in a magical grove deeper in the forest. When they reach the grove, though, they find that the druid has died of old age, and greeting them instead is a gardener's worst nightmare. Plants and trees in this sacred area are all withering and decaying. The most aggressive evidence of this is the Splinter Matron, a former dryad whose tree is dying. The gnarled and decrepit form of the once friendly tree spirit makes itself known to the party, and, as it isn't completely corrupted yet, is willing to talk with them. Through this fey being, the party is able to learn that the nearby village was supposed to be tending to the forest and keeping it healthy, but they had stopped doing so a long time ago. The old druid had been picking up the slack while they were alive, and now that they're not, the forest is rapidly progressing towards its end.
My sisters and I had an agreement with the village. They have since forgotten the arrangement, and that foolish druid used his own life force to cover for them. With him gone, and ourselves forgotten, the forest is dying. But before we pass, we shall get what we are rightfully owed. That alone might be enough to save us.
The former dryad and others like her were the reason a deal had to be struck between the villagers, as they didn't like the villagers settling in their area. It can be revealed that the druid was using their magic to keep things alive and healthy for the villagers' sake, but with them gone, the forest is starting to die. So, as a last-ditch effort to save the forest, the Splinter Matron figured an appropriate course of action would be to try and collect the life from the villagers as back pay for the arrangement. The first step was to lay siege to the village using the forest itself, which is where your party came in. And that's about it for the encounter. Your party just needs to figure out how they want to deal with all of this, of which there are a couple options. I'll be covering those in the questions section along with some other important things to consider. So let's get going on that. Jumping straight into the questions with question 1 here, how many Splinter Matrons should we use? These creatures are CR7, so if we have a 5th level party of 5, then just one of them is going to be a medium encounter if it comes down to combat. That's not terrible if you manage to wear the party down enough on their way into the forest, but if you didn't, then it might be too easy to use just one of them. 2 Splinter Matrons could of course work at that level, but that might be too deadly an encounter, so what would a good middle ground be? For this, I'd say 1 Splinter Matron, and, since the creature has a ranged attack, several more that are fused to some dead trees in the area and that are able to use that ranged attack each round. Almost like a lair action. For question 2, we have, what is this bargain? In the last video, and in the summary for this video, I talked about the idea of a bargain. This is something that the villagers nearby had to agree to in order to live here peacefully. In short, the villagers wanted to settle in the area, and to do so, they had to agree to take care of the land. The villagers over time forgot this agreement for some reason, and the forest started to fall to neglect. The old druid picked up the slack, but when they died, the forest started to rapidly decay, which caused the dryads to turn into angry Splinter Matrons. Of course, you're free to come up with a different bargain that might suit your world more. Or, if you wanted to say that the dryads were corrupted by a BBEG for reasons, you could go that route too. If you do want to create your own bargain, then consider the following points. What does the forest want? What does the village want? How are those two wants opposed? And what could bring a compromise? For the third question, we have what possible outcomes could there be to this encounter? The easiest outcome would be for this encounter to devolve into combat. The Splinter Matron is angry, aggressive, and seeking revenge on the villagers for the slow death of the forest and her sisters. Combine that with the fact that they're typically chaotic evil and have an intense hatred of the Fae means that you have everything you need for a guilt-free combat. At least, guilt-free to start. If the Splinter Matron dies and nothing changes in regards to the village and the forest, then it makes sense that the village could continue to just wither and die. The result here being that the village now has lower crop yields, the dangerous beasts that lived in the forest turn to the village for food, things like that. However, if combat doesn't sound interesting in this situation, then don't do combat. I stated earlier that the Splinter Matron isn't completely corrupted yet and is willing to talk with the party. I see no reason that you can't expand that to working with the party. If the party can find a way to heal the grove or the trees, then I'd say the Splinter Matron could even revert back to a dryad. Let your players tell you how they would like to fix the trees, and if they make a good case for the skills they want to use, then let them roll it. And finally, can the forest even be saved? This one is actually entirely up to you and depends on the tone of your world. You could say yes and allow the party to come up with ways to heal the trees and stop the village from getting attacked. But even with this approach, you could still end up with the fail state of the forest not getting healed, simply because the dice were against the party here. That's okay and should be considered if you run something like this. If you're running a darker game, you could just say no. The forest will die and the village will suffer. This would lead to your party needing to convince the villagers that it's too late and they should move on. If you've ever encountered this sort of thing in fiction before, then you'll know that people won't leave their homes so easily. Some might, but then what about the ones that don't move on? If you go with this route and the villagers elect to stay in the area, you could say that the forest will continue to attack the village until there's nothing left, or the corruption starts spreading to the people. Apply some logic to the order of events, and you've got a potentially tragic but compelling narrative. Alright, with those questions out of the way, this part of the encounter picks up after your party has met with the Treants from the last video. They make their way deeper into the woods, and if you feel like it's appropriate, you can throw some more combat or skill challenges at the party as they travel deeper. Demonstrate that this area of the forest is angry, and you also have a foreshadow that they're headed in the right direction. Once the party reaches the old druid's grove, they can immediately tell that they're in a deeply magical and sacred space. Several trees in the vicinity are unfortunately dying or are already dead from some sort of disease, and nearby is a hut that looks like it could have belonged to the old druid. If your party pokes their heads inside the hut, then they can find the body of the druid resting peacefully in their bed. An investigation of the body will tell them that the druid simply died of natural causes and that there's nothing to be done. As they leave the hut, though, they can notice that they're being watched by an individual, the Splinter Matron. I'll leave it up to you to say whether or not they need to roll something to spot her, but once she sees that she's been seen, she'll approach and ask what the party is doing here. As you all step out of the druid's hut, you notice that there's a creature that looks like an angry elderly woman made of wood watching you. As they notice you notice them, they start to make their way over.
My sisters and I want to know what you're doing in our woods.
As she says this, she gestures to the surrounding area, and that's when you notice that in all of the diseased or dead trees, there are similarly featured lifeless figures embedded in them. If the party asks her who she is, she'll tell them that her and her sisters were the keepers of the magic in these woods, and that the village must pay for what they've done. As for what the village has done, see question 2 from earlier. If your party takes this as hostile intent, then combat can begin. For this approach, I would recommend allowing the Splinter Matron to have access to the Dryad's Tree Stride ability, with the slight change of Living Tree becoming Any Tree. At the top of every round, Splinter Matrons that are permanently bound to their trees take shots at the party with their ranged splinter attack. Doing this should provide a reasonable challenge to the party, as well as some variability for a one-on-many fight. If that doesn't feel like enough of a challenge, then including some low CR beasts to balance out the action economy can go a long way here without becoming overwhelmed. If your party wants to try talking things out though, then they can learn that the Splinter Matron and her sisters were the living embodiment of the magic in the woods. Without them, the forest will die, and the village along with it. However, if the party can heal the trees and convince the village to begin caring for the forest again, then I would call that a success. Speaking of healing the trees, if you're playing 5th edition D&D, then the Paladin's Lay on Hands ability works great for this. Every 5 points spent can cure a disease, so either require 50 points of Lay on Hands be used, or have 10 diseased trees that need to be cured. Doing it this way could set things up for the party to stay the night in the grove and potentially hold off hordes of enemies that are trying to protect the forest and aren't making any distinction that the party is actually trying to help. An added twist could also be that the Splinter Matron is in control of herself during the day, but at night she turns on the party. If you go that route, then make a point to either call out directly that it can happen, or describe to your players how, when she attacks them, the Splinter Matron doesn't appear to be in control of herself. At the end of it all, if your party saves the forest, you can reward them with some renown in the village and the surrounding lands, as well as some gold, as is our tradition. 500 gold at 5th level just seems reasonable to me for this, or you could award some magic items that were in the druid's house. When it comes to scaling this, there are 2 approaches. If your party chooses violence, then you can just add in more Splinter Matrons. They're CR7 creatures and their abilities aren't too devastating when they land, so 2 of them for a 10th level or 3 for a 15th level party should be about the same level of difficulty. If you want to beef up just a single one of them, then I'd recommend checking out my Manticore video, where I talk about how to modify a single creature to provide a more interesting fight when they're against many opponents. You can take what I talk about there and apply it here to make the Splinter Matron's bite worse than her bark. Last bit of advice when it comes to the fighty part. You can include some beasts that can aid the Splinter Matron in combat. Higher CR beasts for more difficult fights, or weaker beasts that keep getting refreshed every round, so the party always has more than one target to deal with. If you go with the weaker beasts every round, then consider putting a cap on the total number that can be in combat at one time, for your own sake. When it comes to the non-combat approach, you can always do one of the following. Bump up any DCs you may choose to use for healing the trees or for social encounters. Increase the number of trees that need to be healed. Tell your party that they need to gather a special item to heal the trees and turn that into a completely separate quest. At the end of the day, this option relies on being able to heal the trees, which mostly takes time, and convincing the town to start taking care of the forest again. But the hardest part out of all of this will most likely be convincing the town, and even then, only if you feel it's necessary. For example, say there's a mean or stubborn business owner in town who profits from the forest dying or from the people not tending to the woods. That person then becomes your party's main obstacle in saving the village. I'll leave it up to you to figure out how to fit that in, though, on the chance that you want to go that route. And there you have the second half to a forest encounter with living trees and angry forest spirits that will hopefully help your party to make a name for themselves in the surrounding lands. If you want more reason for using this rather than just because, then consider putting something deep in the forest that the party needs. Maybe this thing is guarded by the forest spirits, or maybe they need to keep the forest spirits alive because they need their help with some upcoming boss battle. There's plenty of room here for additions to make this meaningful to your campaign. You can find a write-up of this encounter combined with the previous one on my Patreon, along with the other content I produce for tabletop RPGs. If you like what I do and want to support my work, then thank you much. Otherwise, a simple like and subscribe is appreciated. Also, if you're curious about what encounter I come up with next or what monster sourcebook I'll be pulling from, then consider turning on notifications so you know when the next video goes up. Otherwise, if you have any questions about this encounter or notice something that I really should have called out but didn't, then why not stop on by the comments down below. As always, thanks for letting me talk at you all, and until next time,
Keep pondering.